The views expressed are solely those of the speaker and not necessarily those of Paltalk.com, AVM Software, or its advertisers.
News Talk is online. News Talk Online is a production of Paltalk.com, the largest multimedia interactive program on the internet with more than 4 million unique users, on demand on iTunes, on demand on YouTube, and now through CRN Digital Talk Radio distributed to cable systems serving 12 million additional households. I'm your host, Gary Baumgarten. The year, and at the end of the year, we always have these shows where we look back. This was the year that was. We look forward, New Year's resolutions, major events in the news. It's rare that we take one subject that has a dubious distinction for the year and focus on it as we will in this ensuing hour, because it is with a great deal of sadness, discouragement, and dismay that I report to you that 2007 will go down as the deadliest year for news media professionals, reporters, photographers, videographers, producers, editors, and others who have died while trying to bring the truth to the public. You know, some of these deaths have been what are known as collateral, people who are in war zones and other dangerous areas, and are unfortunately in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were not specifically targeted, but they died. They recognized the risk when they went in, and this happens, of course. But unfortunately, a great deal of these deaths have been people who have been specifically targeted by regimes, by resistance to regimes, by people who didn't want crusading reporters to get the truth out about the things that they were involved in. In fact, one death I take a little personally myself. It hit close to home. Chauncey Bailey, a reporter in Oakland, California, was doing what he has always done. I was a colleague and friend of his in Detroit. He always strove to tell the truth about what was going on below the surface and was investigating a black Muslim bakery in Oakland, California that was involved in various nefarious activities, and tried to report that to the black community. He was the editor and publisher of a black newspaper in Oakland, California, and he was murdered, targeted by these individuals who had threatened him, trying to shut him up. So it even happens here in the United States, but it happens elsewhere around the world, obviously, as well. Well, there are people who are working to get the word out about this and to try to find protection for journalists, because, you know, there was a day when the journalists, when there were competing sides in a war zone, were allowed freedom to move across enemy lines even. In fact, I have friends who have covered conflicts around the world, clearly not the one currently in Iraq where they specifically target journalists, but others in Latin America and other places where members of the press for part of a battle would be on one side of the enemy lines, and part of the battle would be on the other side of the enemy lines. And they were allowed the freedom to cross back and forth. People would even hold their fire, because each side wanted to get their point of view across to the outside world. So in a strange way, there was a symbiotic relationship between the combatants, both sides, and the journalists. But this is no longer the case. It's very, very dangerous. And even more so sometimes than reporters who are coming from outside, those who parachute in, as we would say, to cover conflicts and then leave. Because they're only there for a short period of time, their exposure is limited, and frankly, if they piss off somebody on one side or the other, it's not a long-term effect. They're not there. They're not laying their head on the same pillow 2 nights in a row. But the indigenous reporters who dare to go out and report what's happening in their communities, they have to stay there. They have to live there. And after the reporters who are doing their tours of duty in Iraq and so forth leave, these brave individuals remain behind and can be targeted years later for having worked to bring the truth to the public, both domestic and internationally. Well, Rodney Pinder is the director of the International News Safety Institute. He's joining us from Brussels. The International News Safety Institute is dedicated to the safety of journalists and news media staff in areas of conflict and other danger. It's a non-governmental, independent institute. It was created in 2003 by news organizations and support groups out of growing concern over the rising incidents of attacks on journalists. More than 1,200 news media workers, journalists, and critical support staff have died in the line of duty in the past decade. The INSI is an unprecedented coalition of news media and individual journalists, media freedom groups, journalists' unions, humanitarian campaigners working to create a culture of safety in news gathering. It raises funds from international donors to provide basic safety training free of charge for journalists around the world who are unable to afford their own. Curious, I want to ask you, Rodney, one of my first questions will have to be about the United States, because when I was at CNN, they started giving us training not just for going around into combat zones, but domestically, because of what happened on 9/11. I'm wondering whether you've done any of that. So far, more than 730 trained. Amongst their other initiatives, INSI undertook a global inquiry, the first of its kind, into the causes of journalist deaths and produced a report and recommendations for action by governments and the international community to stem the bloodshed. It worked with members to persuade the UN Security Council to pass a resolution, Resolution 1738, on the safety of journalists in conflict. Let me just tell you very briefly about Rodney Pinder, our guest. He is a former senior foreign correspondent and news executive for Reuters, so he comes from a position of actually having been there. He retired in 2002 after 4 years as global editor for Reuters Television News and more than 20 years covering international affairs in 3 hemispheres. He has covered wars and civil conflicts in the Middle East, Northern Ireland, Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, Southern and South Africa, Indonesia, Iraq, Iran, and the Gulf. Rodney Pinder, welcome to News Talk Online on Paltalk.com.
Thank you, Gary. It's a pleasure to be here with you tonight.
It's a pleasure to have you here with our worldwide audience, and one of the charges I have made for myself in this program that has been on the air a little over a year has been to inform my audience. This is an audience that wants to know what's going on around the world. This is a story that for some reason, I mean, come on, these are fellow journalists. So we have the bully pulpit. We have the means of getting this story out, and yet for some reason, there seems to be a residence towards reporting the attacks on journalists around the world. I don't know why that is. Maybe we just feel uncomfortable reporting on ourselves, and maybe that's the reason why. And thank God there are organizations such as yours who are working to get the word out about this very important issue. So I want to start by thanking you for your efforts.
Well, thank you. You raise an interesting point there, and it's one thing that a point that we always try to stress is that if the news media themselves gave a little bit more publicity